My sister took me to court to steal $10 million from me. She told the judge my sister is sick. She has been mentally ill for years. My mother started crying and nodded along. Then the judge asked, "Do you actually know who she really is?" The courtroom went silent. Their faces turned pale. My name is Gwen. I am 34 years old, and I spent the last 15 years letting my family believe I was a complete failure. The heavy oak doors of the New York family court sealed shut behind me. The air inside felt sterile and cold, but not nearly as cold as the glare my younger sister Paige directed at me from the witness stand. At 31 years old, Paige was the undisputed golden child of our family. She sat there wearing a pristine white designer suit, clutching a tissue in her perfectly manicured hands, and performing the role of the heartbroken, concerned sibling with absolute precision. "Your Honor," Paige said, letting a single tear fall down her cheek. "I am only here because I love my sister. But Gwen has lost her mind. She is completely unfit to manage her own life, and she is hallucinating about possessing $10 million. I am officially petitioning for a permanent conservatorship to protect her from herself." I sat at the respondent table next to my lawyer, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I did not react. I simply watched my sister spin a web of lies designed to strip me of my basic human rights and drain my bank accounts. Sitting in the gallery right behind Paige was our mother, Catherine. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, nodding vigorously at every word Paige spoke. Next to my mother sat Paige's husband, Tyrone. Tyrone was 33, a charismatic African-American man who proudly marketed himself as a self-made tech entrepreneur. He wore a custom-tailored suit and slouched in the wooden gallery bench with the arrogant ease of a man who believed he already owned the room. He caught me looking at him and flashed a smug, mocking smile. Judge Mitchell peered over his reading glasses. He was a man in his late 60s with a reputation for sharp observation and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. He folded his hands on the heavy mahogany bench and looked down at my sister. "Mrs. Page," Judge Mitchell said, his voice echoing in the large room. "You are asking this court to strip an adult woman of her legal and financial autonomy. That requires substantial proof of severe incapacity. Can you explain to the court why you believe your sister is entirely incapable of functioning in society?" Paige sat up taller, eagerly taking the bait. I did not need an internal monologue to remember how much my family despised me. Paige was more than happy to broadcast it to the public record. "Your Honor," Paige testified, her voice ringing with rehearsed sorrow. "Gwen dropped out of college when she was 19 years old. She has been an unstable drifter ever since. She refused to follow the traditional path, refused to find a respectable career, and completely isolated herself from our loving family. She sits alone in a cheap apartment, making up wild fantasies about high-level corporate jobs and massive fortunes, while my husband and I actually work hard for a living to support this family." My mother let out a loud, dramatic sob from the gallery to punctuate the statement. It was a well-coordinated performance. They were painting a picture of a destitute, mentally unstable woman who needed to be locked away so her capable, wealthy relatives could manage the $10 million she supposedly hallucinated about. But we all knew the $10 million was very real, and they wanted every single penny. "She needs constant supervision," Paige continued, gripping the edges of the witness box. "If she is left to her own devices, she will destroy herself. We are simply trying to step in and manage her estate before her delusions cause permanent harm." I listened to her weave this narrative with a calm detachment that seemed to unnerve her. For over a decade, I had allowed them to mock my choices. When I left college early to accept a rare recruitment opportunity, they called me a dropout. When I moved into a modest apartment to quietly build my capital, they called me a failure. They celebrated Tyrone's flashy cars and loud boasting, declaring him the financial savior of the family, while treating me like a charity case. I let them believe it because my actual work required absolute discretion. Judge Mitchell frowned slightly, turning his attention to Paige's attorney. "Counsel, you understand that familial concern and allegations of underachievement do not meet the legal threshold for a permanent conservatorship. Do you have medical evidence to back up these extreme claims?" Paige's lawyer, a slick corporate litigator wearing a watch that cost more than a car, stood up with a triumphant flourish. He picked up a thick manila envelope from his desk. "We certainly do, Your Honor," the lawyer announced, his voice dripping with confidence. "I am submitting to the court a signed sworn affidavit from a top-tier psychiatric specialist. This medical professional conducted an extensive review of Gwen's behavioral history and concluded that she suffers from severe paranoid delusions and schizophrenia. The doctor explicitly recommends that Gwen be committed to a psychiatric facility and stripped of all financial and legal rights immediately." The lawyer handed the document to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. The courtroom atmosphere grew incredibly heavy. A signed psychiatric evaluation was the ultimate weapon in a conservatorship battle. It was the exact tool used to lock people away and drain their assets under the guise of medical care. Paige looked down at me from the witness stand. The sorrowful sister act vanished for a split second, replaced by a cold, victorious smirk. Tyrone leaned forward in the gallery, practically salivating at the thought of getting his hands on my accounts. My mother glared at me with absolute contempt, waiting for the judge to declare me legally incompetent. They thought they had me backed into a corner. They thought the medical evidence was an impenetrable wall that I could never climb over. They believed their expensive lawyer and their fabricated doctor's note would hand them the keys to my life. I did not panic. I did not scream that they were lying. I simply adjusted my glasses, turned to my own lawyer, and spoke in a quiet, steady voice. "Hand the judge the blue folder." My attorney reached for the heavy blue folder resting on the table between us. But before his fingers could even brush the cardboard cover, a sharp, theatrical sob echoed from the gallery behind me. My mother, Catherine, threw herself forward. She gripped the wooden railing that separated the spectators from the court floor, her knuckles turning white. She begged the judge to let her speak. She insisted she needed to testify under oath right this second. She claimed she had to tell the court the absolute truth about the danger her eldest daughter posed to society. Judge Mitchell, a man who clearly despised courtroom drama, narrowed his eyes. He warned her that perjury carried a heavy federal penalty. Catherine eagerly agreed, practically sprinting to the witness stand. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. Once seated, she did not hold back. She weaponized our entire shared history right there on the public record, turning decades of family dynamics into a weapon designed to destroy me. "Your Honor!" Catherine cried out, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "Gwen has been a black hole of misery for this family since she was a teenager. She is an absolute parasite. While my beautiful Paige was out building a respectable life and marrying well, Gwen was living in squalor. She drained my emotional reserves and caused continuous, unbearable embarrassment to our family name. Every time we tried to help her, she spat in our faces. I sat perfectly still, keeping my expression entirely neutral. I let her words wash over me. I did not flinch, which only seemed to fuel her rage. Catherine then turned her tear-filled eyes toward the gallery, specifically toward Paige's husband, Tyrone. Tyrone sat up straighter, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. He flashed a smug, self-satisfied smile, basking in the attention. "Thank God for my son-in-law, Tyrone," Catherine proclaimed loudly, ensuring her voice carried to every corner of the large room. "Tyrone is a brilliant self-made man. He built a legitimate tech empire from nothing. He is the provider this family always needed. Do you know what I had to do just last month? Because Gwen is such a financial drain on us, I had to mortgage my entire retirement home. I signed over the deed to my house to fund Tyrone's latest corporate acquisition because someone in this family actually has to generate wealth and protect our future. I gladly gave him my life savings because he is the only one bringing true pride to this family. Meanwhile, Gwen just sits in her cheap apartment, completely insane, plotting ways to steal the money Tyrone works so hard for." The audacity of her statement hung in the sterile courtroom air. She had just admitted under oath and on the public record that she mortgaged her only home to fund Tyrone's businesses. She thought she was proving my jealousy and incompetence. She thought she was solidifying Tyrone's status as a wealthy savior. She did not realize she was tying her own financial noose tightly around her neck. Catherine was working herself into an absolute frenzy now. Her face flushed red and she completely ignored the judge's instruction to address the bench. Instead, she leaned aggressively over the witness stand and screamed directly at me, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Stop fighting this. Gwen. Tyrone is a millionaire. He is a generous man. He is willing to pay for your asylum out of his own pocket. Why must you always ruin your sister's happiness out of pure psychotic jealousy? You are sick. You need to be locked away where you cannot hurt us anymore. Just sign the papers and let Tyrone take control." The courtroom fell dead silent after her explosive outburst. Paige nodded approvingly from the plaintiff's table, wiping away a fake tear. Tyrone crossed his arms over his chest, looking immensely satisfied with his mother-in-law's unhinged performance. Judge Mitchell stared at Catherine with an unreadable, icy expression. He instructed her to step down from the stand immediately. Catherine obliged, smoothing her expensive dress and casting one last look of absolute disgust in my direction before returning to her seat next to Tyrone. She looked like a woman who believed she had just won a war. My attorney stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the linoleum floor broke the heavy silence. He picked up the blue folder I had prepared and walked it over to the court clerk. The clerk handed it up to the high mahogany bench. Judge Mitchell opened the folder. He spent a long, agonizing minute reading the single document inside. The tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Paige's high-priced corporate lawyer looked slightly confused, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Tyrone uncrossed his arms, leaning forward slightly, the smug smile finally slipping from his face as the silence dragged on. Judge Mitchell picked up the psychiatric affidavit that Paige had submitted just moments before. He held the two documents side by side, his eyes darting between them. His jaw tightened visibly. He placed the papers down flat on his desk and picked up his wooden gavel. He slammed it down against the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack that made my mother physically jump in her seat. "It seems the doctor who signed this evaluation is currently unavailable to testify." The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the silent courtroom. Paige stared at the judge, her perfectly rehearsed expression of sorrow instantly cracking. She gripped the edge of the witness stand, her knuckles turning white. "What do you mean he is unavailable?" Paige asked, her voice losing its gentle weeping cadence and pitching upward into a shrill panic. "My lawyer spoke to his clinic yesterday. He is a highly respected specialist." I finally broke my silence. I did not stand up. I simply leaned forward and looked directly into my sister's panicked eyes. "He was highly respected until 6 o'clock this morning," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "That is when federal agents kicked in the door of his Upper East Side brownstone." Paige gasped, taking a physical step back inside the witness box. Her lawyer immediately began shuffling through his papers, looking frantically between me, his client, and the judge. I turned my attention to the bench. "Your Honor, the blue folder you are holding contains a certified copy of a federal indictment unsealed just 3 hours ago. The psychiatrist my sister hired has been under a joint investigation by the Department of Justice and the FBI for the past 18 months. He was running a highly lucrative cash for diagnoses scheme. For a minimum bribe of $50,000, he would provide fabricated psychiatric evaluations to family members seeking to trap their wealthy relatives in fraudulent conservatorships." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. My mother, Catherine, let out a loud gasp from the gallery, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. Paige looked at her attorney, pleading silently for him to object, but the man was too busy wiping sweat from his forehead. He knew submitting a fraudulent medical evaluation to a judge was a career-ending move. He took a massive step away from Paige, desperately trying to distance himself from the radioactive fallout. Judge Mitchell glared down at the plaintiff's table. His eyes were dark with fury. "Submitting forged medical documents in my courtroom is a direct insult to the judicial process. I will be referring your legal team to the state bar, and I will be forwarding this entire petition to the district attorney for review. This conservatorship hearing is bordering on criminal fraud." The medical angle was completely dead. Paige had failed. She looked absolutely terrified, realizing her golden ticket to my bank accounts was slipping through her fingers and potentially dragging her into a federal conspiracy. But Tyrone was not ready to give up. My brother-in-law stood up from the wooden gallery bench. He smoothed the lapels of his custom $5,000 suit and confidently pushed past the swinging wooden gate that separated the spectators from the legal floor. He did not ask for permission to speak. He simply strutted into the center of the room, exuding the suffocating arrogance of a man who believed his money made him untouchable. "Your Honor, if I may speak," Tyrone announced, his booming voice cutting through the nervous chatter. Judge Mitchell raised an eyebrow at the blatant breach of courtroom protocol. "And who exactly are you?" "I am Tyrone Gwen's brother-in-law and the sole financial provider for this family," he declared proudly. He shot a look of utter disdain in my direction. "Let us forget the doctor for a second. We do not need a medical degree to see what is standing right in front of us. Look at her. She is wearing a basic off-the-rack suit. She lives in a cramped apartment. She has not held a verifiable corporate job in over a decade. She is a destitute, unstable woman who has isolated herself from reality. She makes up wild stories about possessing $10 million because she is completely broke and desperate for attention." I watched him pace back and forth in front of the judge. He was putting on a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. He truly believed I was a pathetic dropout. He had spent years buying into his own hype funded by my mother's remortgaged house, and he thought his fake wealth could steamroll the legal system. "She is a danger to herself because she has zero financial literacy and zero means to support herself," Tyrone continued, gesturing grandly with his hands. "But I am not here to abandon family. I am a highly successful entrepreneur. I know how to manage assets. I know how to generate wealth. I am officially stepping in right now to volunteer as her legal and financial guardian. I will take full control of her estate, whatever pennies are left of it, and ensure she does not end up homeless on the streets of New York." My mother cheered from the gallery. She actually clapped her hands together. "Thank God for Tyrone," she shouted, completely ignoring the bailiff's warning glare. "He is a millionaire. He is stepping up to save her." Tyrone smiled, soaking in the praise. He walked over to his sleek leather briefcase resting on the gallery bench, snapped the golden latches open, and pulled out a massive, heavy document. He marched right up to the clerk's desk and dropped it with a loud, theatrical thud. "I do not just talk big, Your Honor," Tyrone boasted, puffing out his chest. "I deliver. What you are looking at is a glossy, 50-page financial acquisition portfolio. As of this morning, I finalized the paperwork to become the sole owner and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. It is a massive tech conglomerate worth tens of millions of dollars. I have the resources, the business acumen, and the liquid capital to be her legal guardian." The heavy thud of the portfolio against the clerk's desk echoed through the courtroom like a physical strike. Tyrone stood there perfectly comfortable in the center of the legal floor, as if he had just closed a high-stakes boardroom negotiation rather than interrupted a federal fraud investigation. He adjusted his cufflinks, flashing a heavy gold watch that caught the fluorescent lights overhead. He was putting on a show, and he knew his audience. Or at least he thought he did. Judge Mitchell stared at the thick binder resting on the desk, his expression hardening. He did not immediately reach for it. Instead, he looked at Tyrone, studying the man's arrogant posture and complete disregard for courtroom decorum. "I am a builder, Your Honor," Tyrone continued, his voice resonating with deep, practiced authority. "I take failing ventures, broken systems, and I fix them. I restructure them for maximum profitability. And yes, that applies to my tragic sister-in-law as well. Let me outline my proposal for Gwen's long-term care." He began to pace back and forth in front of the judge's bench, acting as if he were delivering a keynote speech at a tech conference. "Since Gwen clearly lacks the mental capacity to handle basic adult responsibilities," Tyrone said, gesturing dismissively in my direction, "I am willing to absorb her entire estate into my personal asset management firm. I will personally oversee her housing and her healthcare. I will set up a supervised trust, and I will put her on a strict monthly allowance of $500. That is more than enough for her to buy groceries for her tiny apartment and pay for a bus pass. We will manage her delusions by keeping her on a tight leash. It is the only humane thing to do." Paige nodded eagerly from the plaintiff table, her confidence fully restored. The catastrophic failure of her forged psychiatric evaluation was suddenly forgotten, completely overshadowed by her husband's display of immense wealth. "Your Honor, my husband is a visionary," Paige chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. He works 18 hours a day, managing his tech conglomerate. We are offering to take on this massive burden because we are a family of faith and duty. Tyrone is willing to sacrifice his valuable time to make sure my sister does not end up institutionalized on the state's dime. He is stepping up to save her from her own incompetence. My mother could not contain herself. The display of financial dominance was exactly the kind of social currency Catherine worshipped. She stood up from the wooden gallery bench, her voice trembling with fierce, misplaced pride. She completely ignored the bailiff who motioned for her to sit back down. "Do you see the kind of man my daughter married?" Catherine announced to the entire room. "Tyrone is a self-made king. He is a proud African-American man who started with absolutely nothing. He faced real adversity. He hustled his way to the very top of the corporate ladder through sheer brilliance and relentless hard work. He did not ask for handouts. He built an empire with his bare hands." Catherine then turned her furious gaze toward me. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at my face, her voice dripping with venom. "And then there is you, Gwen. You were born with every privilege in the world. We paid for your tuition at a top university. We gave you every advantage, every opportunity to succeed, and you threw it all into the gutter. You quit school to be a nobody. You have done nothing but embarrass this family for 15 years. Tyrone built an empire from dirt, and you cannot even keep a basic job. You should be down on your knees kissing his shoes for offering to save your pathetic life." The sheer toxicity of her words hung heavily in the sterile courtroom air. This was the dynamic I had endured my entire life. Any achievement of mine would have been dismissed, but because I had chosen to let them believe I was a failure, their contempt had multiplied into outright hatred. They worshipped Tyrone because he performed wealth in a way they understood. He drove the right cars, wore the right labels, and spoke with the aggressive confidence of a man who believed his own lies. Tyrone stopped pacing and stood next to Paige, resting a comforting hand on her shoulder. He looked at Judge Mitchell with an expression of profound fake sympathy. "We just want what is best for her, Your Honor," Tyrone said softly. "We want to protect her $10 million delusion from causing her further psychological harm. Give me the conservatorship and I will handle everything." I sat at the respondent table listening to their coordinated attack. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my past. I did not scream that I had spent the last 15 years building a career that required a level of intellectual rigor they could not even comprehend. I simply stood up from my chair. The courtroom went entirely still as I walked over to the court clerk's desk. I reached out and picked up the heavy, glossy financial portfolio Tyrone had dropped there moments before. The cover was bound in expensive leather, stamped with a sleek, silver minimalist logo for Vanguard Holdings. Tyrone watched me with a sneer. He crossed his arms over his expensive suit, clearly waiting for me to be intimidated by the sheer volume of his fabricated wealth. He expected me to crumble at the sight of corporate documents. I opened the heavy binder. I bypassed the flashy executive summary, the meaningless mission statements, and the colorful graphs designed to impress amateur investors. I flipped directly to the second page, scanning the fine print of the financial disclosures section. My eyes darted across the numbers printed on the crisp white paper. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I looked up from the portfolio and met Tyrone's arrogant gaze. The absolute certainty in his eyes faltered for a fraction of a second when he saw my smile. "Tell me, Tyrone," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent courtroom. "Exactly how much cash did you put down to acquire Vanguard Holdings?" Tyrone let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He casually adjusted his silk tie and turned slightly so the entire gallery could hear his response. He looked at me as if I were a child, asking a painfully stupid question. He clearly thought he was holding all the winning cards, and he was more than happy to show them off. "Your Honor!" "I am glad," she asked. Tyrone said, his voice booming with artificial warmth. "It shows she is finally trying to learn something about real money. Perhaps if she pays close attention, she might understand why she needs a guardian to manage her affairs." He took 2 steps closer to the judge's bench, commanding the space like a corporate stage. "I acquired Vanguard Holdings for a steal," Tyrone boasted, puffing out his chest. "The market valuation was completely mismanaged by the previous board. I saw the vulnerability and I struck. I put down exactly $2.5 million in liquid cash, a fraction of its actual worth. I secured the rest of the acquisition through leveraged asset allocation. It is without a doubt the business deal of the century. Paige beamed from the plaintiff's table. She sat up incredibly straight, making sure everyone in the courtroom noticed her glowing pride. She looked at her husband with absolute adoration, completely oblivious to the trap that had just snapped shut around them. Judge Mitchell leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together on the mahogany desk. And how exactly does a private citizen leverage the remainder of a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition? Mr. Tyrone? What collateral did you put up to secure such a massive loan? Tyrone smiled, flashing his perfectly white teeth. I utilized my impeccable credit, Your Honor. And of course, I utilized private family backing. That is what a functional, loving family does. We invest in each other. We build generational wealth together. From the gallery, my mother could not contain herself. The overwhelming urge to validate Tyrone and simultaneously humiliate me proved too strong for her to resist. Catherine jumped to her feet once again, her eyes shining with manic excitement. I gave him the collateral, Catherine announced loudly, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. I signed over the deed to my house. The court reporter stopped typing for a fraction of a second. Judge Mitchell slowly turned his gaze from Tyrone to the woman standing in the gallery. You mortgaged your home to fund his corporate buyout, Judge Mitchell asked, his voice low and dangerously flat. I did it gladly, Catherine proclaimed, lifting her chin with aggressive defiance. I went to the bank with him myself. I signed the paperwork without hesitation. Do you want to know why? Because Tyrone actually knows how to multiply wealth? He is a visionary. He turns thousands into millions. She then turned her furious, resentful glare directly onto me. Her hands gripped the wooden railing in front of her. Unlike you, Gwen. Catherine sneered, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. You are a financial black hole. I would not trust you with a $10 bill. You have never built anything. You have never achieved anything. You just sit in the shadows and complain while the real adults in this family take risks and reap the rewards. I gladly staked my entire retirement, my sanctuary, the roof over my own head on Tyrone. He is a real man. He is a provider. And he is the only reason this family has any future at all. Her words hung in the sterile air of the courtroom. She had said it all on the public record. She had freely admitted to risking everything she owned just to spite me and elevate her golden son-in-law. She thought she was delivering the ultimate crushing blow to my ego. She thought she was proving my total worthlessness to a federal judge. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or hurt. I simply closed the heavy, glossy cover of Tyrone's 50-page financial portfolio. I placed it gently down on the edge of the clerk's desk. It made a soft, insignificant sound. I turned my back on Tyrone and walked slowly toward my attorney's table. Every eye in the room followed my movements. The heavy silence was broken only by the steady clicking of my heels against the linoleum floor. I reached down and unzipped my slim black leather briefcase. I bypassed the thick stacks of legal motions and federal statutes. I reached into a specific side pocket and pulled out a single sheet of standard white printer paper. It was not bound in expensive leather. It was not printed on glossy cardstock. It was just a plain, unadorned document. I turned around to face my family. Tyrone was still standing in the center of the room, his hands resting on his hips, wearing a look of supreme confidence. Paige was still smiling. My mother was still standing in the gallery, breathing heavily from her hateful speech, waiting for me to break down and cry. I looked directly into Catherine's eyes. I kept my voice perfectly calm, perfectly professional, and entirely devoid of mercy. That is fascinating, Mom, I said. I held up the single sheet of paper by the corner. Because Tyrone did not transfer $2.5 million to Vanguard Holdings, he wired it to a shell account in the Cayman Islands. I did not wait for my mother to process the shock. I reached into the slim front pocket of my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of certified financial records. I walked directly to the court clerk and handed over the original stamped copies for the judge. Then I turned and dropped a duplicate stack right onto the desk of Tyrone's high-priced corporate lawyer. The lawyer scrambled to pick them up. His eyes darted aggressively across the highlighted routing numbers and swift codes printed on the pages. The color rapidly drained from his face as he realized exactly what he was holding. "Your Honor," I said, maintaining my perfectly even tone. "The documents you are holding detail the exact trajectory of the $2.5 million my mother so generously provided. Tyrone did not leverage a single cent of that money for corporate acquisition. He did not invest it into a tech conglomerate. He wired the entire sum to a corporate entity known as Apex Global Ventures, which is registered to a post office box in the Cayman Islands." Judge Mitchell adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes locked on the wire transfer receipts. The courtroom was dead silent. I could hear the sharp intake of breath from the gallery where my mother stood. Tyrone stood frozen in the center of the legal floor. The arrogant swagger had completely vanished from his posture. His hands, previously resting confidently on his hips, fell limply to his sides. I turned to my mother. She was gripping the gallery railing so hard her knuckles were bone white. "Apex Global Ventures is not a tech firm, Mom," I said, clearly ensuring every spectator in the room heard the truth. "It is an offshore sportsbook, an illegal gambling syndicate." Tyrone did not buy a company. He paid off a catastrophic offshore gambling debt. You did not invest in a visionary entrepreneur. You mortgaged your retirement home to fund his crippling gambling addiction and keep loan sharks off his back. For a few agonizing seconds, no one breathed. The polished, charismatic illusion that my family had built their entire identity around was shattering into a million jagged pieces right in front of them. Then Tyrone snapped. The facade broke entirely. He lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. Sweat beaded on his forehead, ruining his perfectly manicured appearance. He violently tugged at the collar of his bespoke suit, suddenly looking like a trapped animal. "Lies," Tyrone roared, his voice cracking with pure panic. "These are completely fabricated. She is lying to the court." He turned wildly toward Judge Mitchell, waving his hands in the air. "Your Honor, look at her," Tyrone shouted, desperation leaking into his tone. "I told you she was insane. She has been obsessed with me and my wife for years. She sits in her miserable little apartment festering with jealousy because she has nothing. She hacked into my personal bank accounts. She stole my financial identity. She doctored these banking documents to make me look like a criminal. This is a massive cybercrime. She is trying to ruin my life because she is a pathetic, broke loser who cannot stand to see a black man succeed." Paige leaped up from the plaintiff table, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floor. She rushed to stand beside her husband, her face flushed with frantic rage. She pointed an accusing finger at me, matching Tyrone's chaotic energy. "He is right!" Paige screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "She is a cyber terrorist. This proves everything we have been saying. Gwen is a dangerous lunatic. She hacked my husband. She forged federal banking documents just to destroy our family out of pure spite. She belongs in a padded cell. We told you she was unhinged." My mother chimed in from the gallery, desperate to keep her grand illusion alive. The psychology of her denial was profound. She simply could not accept that she had signed away her home for a lie. "She is a criminal," Catherine wailed, pointing her own shaking finger at me. "I knew it. I knew she was stealing. Tyrone is a good man. Tyrone is a millionaire. Arrest her. Punish her for what she is doing to my beautiful family. She is trying to destroy the only successful man in this room." Paige slammed her hands down on her table and turned her furious gaze toward the armed court bailiff standing by the heavy wooden doors. "Do not just stand there," Paige demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "She just admitted to committing identity theft and digital forgery in front of a family court judge. She hacked a multimillionaire. Arrest her right now. Put her in handcuffs. She is a threat to society." The courtroom held its collective breath. The noise of my family's shouting faded into a tense, heavy silence. The bailiff, a towering, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, looked at Paige. He looked at the screaming, frantic woman, demanding immediate justice. Then he looked up at Judge Mitchell, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The bailiff stepped down from his post by the door. He placed his heavy hand firmly over his utility belt. His heavy boots thumped loudly against the floor as he bypassed the gallery entirely. He did not look at Tyrone. He did not look at my mother. He walked directly toward me. The heavy thud of the bailiff's boots against the polished floor echoed like a countdown. He was a massive man, an imposing figure of law enforcement, and his trajectory was set entirely on me. The courtroom collectively held its breath. The silence was so profound I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents high above us. But the quiet did not last long. My mother shattered the tension with a loud, triumphant cheer. She leaned over the wooden railing of the gallery, her face completely transformed by vindictive joy. She actually clapped her hands together, tears of pure relief streaming down her cheeks. Finally, Catherine yelled, her voice vibrating with hysterical excitement. "Lock her up! Put her in chains! She is a danger to this family and a danger to society! Take her away right now before she hurts someone!" Paige stood at the plaintiff table, vibrating with victorious energy. She crossed her arms, her chest heaving as she glared at me with absolute hatred. She thought she had done it. She thought her demand, fueled by her husband's fake wealth, had successfully weaponized the legal system against me. Tyrone mirrored her posture. He ran a hand over his sweating forehead, exhaling a massive breath. The panic that had gripped him moments before was quickly replaced by a sickening, arrogant smirk. He honestly believed his lies were enough to have me dragged out of the room in handcuffs. He looked at me as if I were a pest that was finally being exterminated. They all waited for the moment I would break. They waited for me to beg, to cry, to drop to my knees and plead with the judge for mercy. They wanted to see me humiliated on the public record, dragged away like a common criminal, to be locked in a cell while they drained my bank accounts. I gave them absolutely nothing. I stood perfectly still behind the respondent table. I did not flinch as the towering bailiff closed the distance between us. I did not break eye contact with him. My posture remained rigid and calm. When he stopped just 2 feet away from me, his hand resting firmly on the heavy metal cuffs clipped to his utility belt, the entire room went dead silent again. Everyone waited for the metallic click of restraints. Instead of raising my hands in surrender, I calmly unbuttoned the center button of my tailored suit jacket. Paige gasped loudly. She pointed a frantic finger at me. "Watch out!" Paige shrieked, jumping behind her chair. "She is reaching for a weapon. I told you she was psychotic." The bailiff tensed his hand, hovering over his sidearm. But I moved slowly, deliberately, broadcasting my intentions. I reached into the concealed inner pocket of my jacket. My fingers brushed against the thick, reinforced leather of my credential wallet. I pulled it out and flipped it open with a smooth, practiced motion. I did not hand him a standard state driver license. I did not hand him a generic business card. I extended a heavy, embossed, secure identification card. The card featured a holographic government seal, a microchip strip, and a bold red banner across the top indicating a high-level federal clearance. I held it out right in front of the bailiff's chest. "I suggest you read the back of this credential before you make a decision that will end your career in law enforcement," I said quietly. My tone was not a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. The bailiff hesitated. His eyes darted from my face to the heavy identification card in my hand. He slowly reached out and took the leather wallet from my grasp. The courtroom was completely frozen. Even my mother had stopped cheering. The atmosphere shifted from chaotic anticipation to deep, unsettling confusion. The family that had been screaming for my arrest was now forced to watch a scene they could not comprehend. The bailiff scrutinized the card. He looked at the holographic seal reflecting the overhead lights. He turned the card over and read the dense, federally mandated text printed on the back. I watched the physical transformation take over his entire body. The rigid, authoritative stance of a man preparing to make an arrest instantly dissolved. His broad shoulders dropped. The hard line of his jaw slacked into an expression of profound shock. His eyes widened as he looked up from the card and stared directly into my face. The realization of exactly who he was dealing with hit him like a freight train. He snapped the leather wallet shut. He did not hand it back to me with the casual disregard of a court officer dealing with a civilian. He stepped back, squared his shoulders, and extended the wallet back to me with a sharp, respectful nod. His demeanor had shifted from enforcement to absolute deference. "Thank you, Ma," the bailiff said, his voice completely devoid of its previous intimidation. My apologies for the interruption. He turned his back on me. He walked away from the respondent table and marched right back to his post by the heavy wooden doors. He folded his hands behind his back and stood at ease, completely ignoring my family. The collective shock in the room was palpable. The air was sucked out of the space. My mother's mouth hung wide open. Tyrone took a physical step backward, bumping into the wooden partition. Paige lost her mind. The smug satisfaction vanished from her face, replaced by unhinged fury. She slammed her hands flat on her table, leaning aggressively toward the center of the room. "What are you doing?" Paige screamed at the bailiff. Her voice cracked, echoing harshly off the walls. "Why are you walking away from her? I gave you an order. She just admitted to hacking a multimillionaire. She forged banking documents. She is a criminal. Cuff her right now. Do your job and arrest that lunatic." The bailiff did not flinch at her screaming. He did not look at the judge for guidance this time. He simply turned his head and locked eyes with my sister. His expression was incredibly cold, completely lacking the patience he had shown earlier. He spoke with the flat, unquestionable authority of a man who knew the law intimately. "Ma'am," the bailiff stated coldly, his voice slicing through her hysterical demands. "I do not have the jurisdiction to detain a Class 1 federal contractor without a warrant from the Department of Justice." The words Class 1 federal contractor hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. The air was sucked out of the room. For a brief second, nobody moved. The bailiff returned to his post by the heavy double doors, his posture rigid and professional, completely ignoring the sputtering outrage coming from my sister's side of the room. Paige stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The triumphant fury that had consumed her face just moments before melted into utter bewilderment. She looked at her husband, desperately searching for an explanation that fit the narrative they had spent years constructing. Tyrone broke the silence with a loud, incredibly forced laugh. It was a harsh, nervous sound that echoed unnaturally against the high walls of the courtroom. He clapped his hands together once, shaking his head as he stepped forward. "Your Honor, this is exactly what I have been talking about. This proves my point perfectly. Look at the lengths she will go to. She bought a fake badge on the internet. She is flashing a Halloween prop in a federal building. This woman is completely unhinged." Tyrone paced in a tight circle, throwing his hands up in mock disbelief. He projected the image of a reasonable businessman dealing with an erratic relative. She probably found some dark website, paid $50 for a piece of plastic, and actually convinced herself she works for the government. This is textbook schizophrenia. It is a severe paranoid delusion. She is standing in a court of law impersonating a federal agent to avoid a conservatorship. She belongs in a psychiatric ward today. My mother, Catherine, seized the opportunity to pile on. She nodded vigorously from the gallery, clutching her purse to her chest. "Yes, exactly. She has always lived in a fantasy world. She has no job. Your Honor, she is a dropout. Do not let her play games with this court. Arrest her for lying to you." I remained entirely silent. I did not need to defend the authenticity of my credentials. The bailiff, a trained officer of the court, had already verified the holographic security features and the embedded microchip. He knew it was real, and more importantly, Judge Mitchell knew it was real. Seeing that the judge was not immediately ordering my arrest, Tyrone signaled to his attorney. The high-priced corporate lawyer stood up. He was a man who charged $1,000 an hour to bully people into submission. He adjusted his silk tie, attempting to regain control of the narrative through sheer legal intimidation. "Your Honor," the corporate lawyer stated, his voice dripping with practiced indignation. "My client is a highly respected entrepreneur. He is a prominent figure in the tech industry and a pillar of the community. We came here today out of familial duty to secure care for an unwell relative. Instead, we have been subjected to wild accusations, fabricated wire transfers, and now a blatant attempt to impersonate a federal contractor." The lawyer gestured sharply toward my table. "We demand an immediate emergency gag order against the respondent. She is utilizing this public forum to commit egregious defamation against my client. We demand all documents she submitted be stricken from the record, and we request that she be held in contempt until she complies with a psychiatric hold." She is actively attempting to tarnish a multi-million-dollar enterprise with these ridiculous stunts. My attorney, who had been sitting quietly beside me the entire time, finally stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not match the aggressive, theatrical energy of Tyrone's legal team. He calmly picked up a thick bound document from our table. The document was secured with a heavy red staple binding a standard marker for federal filings. He walked around the respondent table and approached the court clerk. "Your Honor," my attorney said, his tone conversational but firm. "We have no interest in engaging with opposing counsel regarding gag orders or defamation claims. We are bypassing those trivial complaints entirely. At this time, we are submitting a formal motion to the court." Judge Mitchell peered over his glasses. "A formal motion regarding what, counselor?" My attorney handed the original document to the clerk and turned to face the judge. "A motion to consolidate, Your Honor. We are officially requesting that this family court conservatorship hearing be immediately consolidated with an active ongoing federal fraud investigation under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice." The courtroom shifted instantly. The word federal carries a specific weight in any legal setting, but when used in conjunction with a fraud investigation, it acts like poison gas. The confident posture of Tyrone's lawyer completely evaporated. My attorney took a duplicate copy of the bound document and walked over to the plaintiff's table. He placed it gently on the desk right in front of the corporate lawyer. "I believe you will find the docket numbers and the assigned federal prosecutors listed on the first page," my attorney noted politely. The corporate lawyer picked up the document. He flipped open the cover page. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal text. I watched as he read the specific federal statutes cited. I watched as he saw the names of the prosecuting attorneys and the official seal of the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. The physical reaction was instantaneous and profound. All the color completely drained from the corporate lawyer's face. He turned a sickly shade of pale gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that the paper shook in his grip. He dropped the document back onto the table as if it were burning his skin. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at me. He looked at Tyrone. The expression on the lawyer's face was one of absolute undisguised terror mixed with furious realization. He realized he had not been hired to manage a simple family conservatorship. He realized his client had lied to him, manipulated him, and dragged him directly into the crosshairs of a massive federal sting operation. The lawyer took a sudden, massive step backward, physically distancing himself from Tyrone. He bumped into his own chair, creating a loud scraping sound, but he did not stop moving until there were at least 3 feet of empty space between him and his client. He looked as though he wanted to sprint out of the courtroom doors. Tyrone noticed the dramatic shift. His arrogant sneer vanished. He looked at his lawyer, his eyes darting back and forth in confusion. "What are you doing?" Tyrone demanded, keeping his voice to a harsh whisper. "Why are you backing away from me? What does that piece of paper say? Tell the judge to throw it out." The lawyer did not answer. He just kept staring at the federal docket numbers, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the trap they had just walked into. The corporate lawyer did not answer Tyrone. He did not defend his client or attempt to argue the validity of the federal document. Instead, he snapped his expensive leather briefcase shut with a loud, definitive click. His hands were shaking so violently, he fumbled with the golden latches. "What are you doing?" Tyrone hissed, grabbing the lawyer by the sleeve of his suit. "I am paying you $1,000 an hour. Tell the judge to throw that garbage out. Tell him she is lying." The lawyer physically yanked his arm out of Tyrone's grip. He stepped back, keeping his voice low but laced with absolute panic. "I was retained for a standard family court conservatorship hearing," the lawyer stammered, refusing to make eye contact with the man paying him. "I am not equipped, nor am I retained to represent you in an active federal fraud investigation under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice. My firm does not handle federal criminal defense. You need to find other representation immediately." With that, the lawyer turned his back on Tyrone, nodded stiffly to the judge, and practically sprinted down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind him, sealing Tyrone's isolation. Tyrone stood entirely alone at the plaintiff table. The arrogant, untouchable tech mogul facade was disintegrating in real time. He looked wildly around the room, the reality of his situation finally piercing through his delusions of grandeur. He had walked into a family court to steal $10 million from a woman he thought was a helpless dropout. Now his legal counsel had abandoned him and he was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Sitting just a few feet away, Paige watched the entire exchange unfold. She saw her husband's lawyer flee. She saw the sheer terror on Tyrone's face. She saw Judge Mitchell actively reading the federal motion my attorney had submitted, completely ignoring Tyrone's protests. Paige realized in a fraction of a second that they were losing control of the narrative. The sheer force of my financial and legal authority was crushing them. Paige knew she could not fight facts. She could not argue federal law. So she resorted to the only weapon she had left in her arsenal. She resorted to pure, unadulterated emotional manipulation. Paige's breathing suddenly became ragged and shallow. She clutched her chest, her manicured fingers digging into the pristine white fabric of her designer suit. She let out a sharp, high-pitched gasp that echoed loudly in the quiet courtroom. She knocked her chair backward. It hit the floor with a loud crash as Paige collapsed to her knees. She threw her hands up to her throat, clawing at her own skin as if she were suffocating. She began to hyperventilate, taking in huge, gulping breaths of air, rocking back and forth on the hard linoleum floor. It was a spectacular theatrical performance. She was throwing a massive fake panic attack designed to derail the proceedings and force everyone to focus on her as the ultimate victim. "I cannot breathe!" Paige wailed, her voice cracking as she collapsed fully onto her side. "She is hurting me. She is ruining my life. Make her stop." From the gallery, my mother reacted exactly as Paige knew she would. Catherine leaped up from the wooden bench, completely ignoring courtroom decorum. She shoved the swinging wooden gate open and rushed onto the legal floor, diving down next to her golden child. Catherine pulled Paige's head into her lap, stroking her hair, and crying out in manufactured agony. She looked up from the floor, her eyes burning with a lifetime of venom and misplaced resentment. She locked her furious gaze on me. She did not care about the judge. She did not care about the federal documents. She only cared about destroying me to protect the illusion of her perfect daughter. "Look what you are doing!" Catherine screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls. "You are a monster. You have always bullied her. Ever since you were children, you could not stand to see her shine. You are trying to kill your sister with your sick lies just because no man ever loved you." She held Paige tighter, rocking her back and forth as Paige continued to fake heavy, shuddering gasps. "You are a bitter, lonely, psychotic failure," Catherine yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me from the floor. "You could not get a husband. You could not build a family. You could not even finish college. So you spend your miserable life plotting against the only people in this family who actually achieved something. You made up these fake federal documents just to torture her. You are a sad, pathetic woman, Gwen. You belong in a cage." I stood behind the respondent table, looking down at the two women on the floor. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not argue against the cruel, weaponized history my mother was hurling at me. I watched the theatrical performance with absolute freezing detachment. For 34 years, this had been their playbook. Whenever they were wrong, whenever they were caught, whenever they needed to justify their cruelty, they made themselves the victims and painted me as the aggressor. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to apologize just to make the screaming stop. I looked up at Judge Mitchell. He was sitting behind the high mahogany bench, staring down at my mother and sister with an expression of profound disgust. He was a seasoned family court judge. He recognized emotional manipulation the second he saw it. He did not call for medical assistance. He simply waited for the tantrum to end. I turned to the court clerk sitting just below the judge's bench. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I have a digital exhibit that directly addresses the petitioner's current emotional state and the motive behind this entire conservatorship hearing. May I have permission to pair a device to the courtroom's evidence audio system?" The clerk looked at Judge Mitchell. The judge gave a single firm nod. The clerk pressed a button on his console. The courtroom's Bluetooth audio network became discoverable. Catherine was still screaming from the floor, holding Paige, demanding that I be arrested for causing emotional distress. Tyrone was standing over them, trying to look like a protective husband, while sweating profusely under the weight of his own impending legal doom. I picked up my phone from the table. I did not look at my family. I tapped my screen, navigated to a highly encrypted audio file I had extracted just 48 hours prior, and connected to the courtroom speakers. I tapped play. Suddenly, a crystal-clear audio recording began broadcasting through the high-definition speakers mounted in the ceiling, flooding the entire courtroom with the undeniable sound of my sister's voice. The high-definition speakers mounted in the courtroom ceiling crackled to life. The acoustic transition was incredibly jarring. 1 second my mother was screaming from the linoleum floor, hurling decades of bitter resentment at me. The next second, the unmistakable ambient noise of a high-end Manhattan steakhouse filled the judicial chamber. The crisp sound of clinking crystal wine glasses echoed through the room. The low thumping bass of upscale restaurant background music provided a surreal soundtrack to the sterile legal setting. Then Tyrone's voice boomed through the speakers. It was not the polished, respectful, highly calculated tone he had tried to use with Judge Mitchell moments before. It was loud, deeply arrogant, and noticeably slurred with expensive liquor. "I am telling you, baby, this is the easiest play we have ever run." Tyrone's recorded voice echoed off the courtroom walls. "Your sister is a ghost. She has no friends, no husband, no one checking in on her. We walk into that courtroom, play the concerned family card, and walk out with the keys to her kingdom." Next came Paige's voice. She laughed. It was a sharp, vicious, entirely sober-sounding laugh that cut through the heavy air of the courthouse. "Do you think she suspects anything?" Paige asked on the recording. Her voice layered over the sound of scraping silverware. Gwen Tyrone scoffed loudly on the tape. "Are you kidding me? She is clueless. She has been playing the victim her whole life." We walk and hand the judge that doctor's note we paid for, and walk out. The state hands over her accounts, and we wire the funds offshore before the ink even dries on the court order. I have the Cayman accounts already set up. Once we get the judge to declare Gwen a psycho, we drain her $10 million, Paige stated. The audio was flawless. Every single syllable was crystal clear, capturing the sheer malice in her tone. "We cover your tracks with the IRS, we wipe out the gambling debt, and I finally get my yacht. I have already picked out the interior upholstery." The courtroom froze completely. The brazenness of the recorded conversation paralyzed every single person in the gallery. My mother, Catherine, who was still kneeling on the floor clutching her supposedly hyperventilating golden child, slowly lowered her hands. Her jaw went completely slack. She stared up at the ceiling speakers as if a demon had just spoken from above. Paige's miraculous medical recovery was instantaneous. The hyperventilating stopped immediately. The desperate shuddering gasps for air vanished in a fraction of a second. She did not need medical attention. She did not need a paper bag to breathe into. She did not need her mother to comfort her. Paige shoved my mother's hands away with sudden aggressive force. She scrambled to her feet, her designer heels scraping harshly against the floor. She stood perfectly upright, her face flushing a deep, violently angry shade of crimson. The fragile, terrified victim routine was entirely obliterated by the exposure of her own blinding greed. "Turn that off!" Paige shrieked, pointing wildly at the court clerk's audio console. "Turn it off right now! She hacked my phone. She is spying on us." Tyrone completely lost what little composure he had left. He bounded away from the plaintiff table, stepping dangerously close to the judge's bench. His face was glistening with cold sweat. He waved his arms frantically, shouting over the sound of his own recorded voice still playing from the ceiling. "Objection!" Tyrone roared, attempting to sound like the high-priced corporate lawyer who had just abandoned him. "That is illegal. This is an illegal, unauthorized wiretap. We are in a two-party consent state. That audio is entirely inadmissible in a court of law. You have to strike it from the record immediately." I stood behind the respondent table, maintaining my perfectly neutral posture. I let him scream. I let him incriminate himself further by citing wiretap laws, tacitly admitting to the entire room that the voices on the recording were in fact theirs. Realizing his legal argument was only making him look incredibly guilty, Tyrone abruptly pivoted his defense strategy. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at me, his eyes wide with desperate, unhinged panic. "It is a fake!" Tyrone bellowed, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his collapsing reality. "She generated it. That is what she does sitting in her apartment all day. It is an artificial intelligence voice clone. It is a deep fake. She used computer software to mimic our voices because she is a cyber terrorist trying to frame a legitimate businessman. She fabricated that entire conversation to destroy my impeccable reputation. Paige nodded frantically, latching onto her husband's chaotic excuse like a lifeline. Yes, it is artificial intelligence. We never went to that restaurant. We never said those things. She is framing us. Hold her in contempt, Your Honor. Throw her in jail for presenting fake digital evidence. We demand she be arrested immediately. The contrast between their screaming demands and the cold, hard evidence playing through the speakers was staggering. Tyrone's recorded voice could still be heard bragging about how easily they were going to trick the judge. The real Tyrone was standing in front of that very judge, sweating through his custom suit, screaming about artificial intelligence and cyber terrorism. My mother remained on the floor. She looked from Paige, who was currently shrieking about deepfakes and demanding my arrest, to Tyrone, who looked like a cornered, desperate animal. The grand illusion Catherine had mortgaged her entire life to protect was collapsing right in front of her eyes. The brilliant tech entrepreneur and the perfect daughter were standing in a federal building throwing a tantrum because they had been caught plotting to steal $10 million. The bailiff stepped forward, placing his hand firmly on his utility belt, ready to physically restrain Tyrone if he took one more aggressive step toward the bench. I did not speak. I did not need to defend the authenticity of the recording to a screaming room. As a federal contractor specializing in forensic auditing, my evidence collection protocols were completely airtight. The audio had been legally obtained from a court-authorized wiretap directly related to Tyrone's ongoing federal fraud investigation. It was not just admissible. It was the silver bullet that was going to end his freedom. Judge Mitchell did not look up at the ceiling speakers. He did not look at Paige, who was currently stomping her foot in an unhinged display of rage. He did not look at Tyrone, who was still shouting legal buzzwords he barely understood. Judge Mitchell gripped the wooden handle of his gavel. He raised it high into the air and brought it down against the sounding block with a strike so violently hard, it echoed through the massive room like a gunshot. The deafening crack instantly silenced Paige and Tyrone. They both froze in their tracks, staring up at the bench in absolute silent terror. Judge Mitchell did not yell. He did not demand order from the chaotic floor. He simply sat there, radiating absolute terrifying authority. He was staring intently at the thick red stapled federal motion my lawyer had handed him just moments before. He was reading the exact details of the Department of Justice investigation targeting the man standing in his courtroom. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Mitchell took off his reading glasses. He placed them flat on the mahogany desk. He looked down at my family. The echoing crack of the gavel faded into a suffocating, absolute silence. Not a single person in the massive courtroom dared to breathe. The bailiff remained positioned by the heavy wooden doors, his posture radiating rigid enforcement, completely unfazed by the sudden quiet. Tyrone stood frozen in the center of the legal floor, his mouth still hanging half open from his desperate rant about artificial intelligence and deepfakes. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple and dropped onto the collar of his custom suit, but he did not move to wipe it away. He was paralyzed by the terrifying stillness emanating from the bench. Judge Mitchell did not yell. He did not reprimand Tyrone for his chaotic courtroom outburst. He did not acknowledge Paige, who was now standing perfectly upright, her miraculous recovery from a supposed panic attack entirely complete. Instead, the judge slowly placed his reading glasses flat on the mahogany desk. He folded his hands deliberately over the thick red stapled federal document my attorney had provided just moments ago. His eyes were dark, calculating, and filled with a cold judicial fury that made the air in the room feel 10 degrees colder. He looked down over the edge of the bench, his gaze locked directly onto my mother. Catherine was still awkwardly positioned on the hard linoleum floor, her hands resting on her lap, the vindictive energy completely drained from her features. She looked up at the judge, her eyes wide with sudden dawning apprehension. She realized in that agonizing stretch of silence that the legal system was no longer a weapon she could wield against me. It was a massive, crushing weight dangling right above her head. Mrs. Catherine, Judge Mitchell began, his voice dangerously quiet. The acoustics of the room carried every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. I will deal with you in a moment. But first, I need to address the petitioner. The judge shifted his terrifying gaze away from my mother and locked it onto my sister. Paige swallowed hard. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of the plaintiff table so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. She tried to maintain her posture, trying to project the image of a wealthy, concerned sibling, but her foundation was visibly crumbling under the weight of his stare. Mrs. Page, the judge, continued his tone, cutting through her fragile facade like glass. Let us review the events of this morning. You walked into a federal building, you took the witness stand, you placed your right hand on a Bible, and swore an oath to tell the absolute truth. Under the penalty of severe federal perjury, you looked me directly in the eye and swore that your sister is an unemployed dropout. You testified that she is a destitute burden to society who lives in complete squalor. You testified that she is severely mentally ill, entirely detached from reality, and highly dangerous to herself and to others. Judge Mitchell paused, letting the severity of his summary hang heavily over the room. He turned his head slightly, bringing my mother back into his line of fire. Your mother eagerly corroborated every single word of that testimony, he stated, his voice laced with heavy disgust. She swore that Gwen has never held a job, never achieved a single thing of value, and is nothing more than a psychotic parasite attempting to steal from her brilliant self-made son-in-law. You both stood in my courtroom and demanded that I strip a 34-year-old woman of her basic human rights. You demanded that I seize her financial assets and lock her inside a psychiatric institution based entirely on these claims. The silence stretched again, thick and suffocating. I stood behind the respondent table, my face a mask of absolute calm. I watched my family realize that their decades of gaslighting and manipulation were utterly useless in this arena. They could not scream their way out of this. They could not fake a panic attack to distract the court. They could not use Tyrone's fake wealth to bully a federal judge. They were trapped under the magnifying glass of the law, and there was nowhere left to hide. Judge Mitchell leaned forward over the heavy wooden bench. He laced his fingers together and stared down at the two women who had spent my entire life trying to destroy me. Mrs. Catherine Page. Judge Mitchell said, his voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper that demanded absolute attention. You came into this court to steal $10 million from this woman under the guise of medical guardianship. He paused for 3 agonizing seconds. Do you actually have any idea who she really is? The color instantly drained from Paige's face. Her flawless makeup suddenly looked like a cheap mask painted over pale, terrified skin. Catherine physically flinched on the floor, her eyes darting between me and the judge in absolute bewilderment. Tyrone looked like he was going to be physically sick. The sheer gravity in the judge's question confirmed Tyrone's worst fear. The federal document on the bench was entirely real, and the woman he thought was an easy target was actually the apex predator in the room. Paige shook her head rapidly. She was desperately clinging to the false narrative that was her only shield against reality. If she admitted I was successful, her entire worldview would collapse. She leaned aggressively over the wooden table, her voice trembling with unhinged denial. She is a nobody, Paige stammered, pointing a shaking, desperate finger at me. She is a crazy nobody. She is lying to you. She is just a dropout. She is a sick woman making up stories to ruin my life. Judge Mitchell slowly shook his head in absolute profound disgust. He did not bother arguing with a woman drowning in her own toxic delusions. He simply picked up his reading glasses, slid them back onto his face, and picked up the red stapled federal document. Let us clear up that misconception right now, Judge Mitchell announced, opening the file. He smoothed the crisp white paper flat against his desk and prepared to read the official federal summary aloud to the silent captive court. Let us clear up that misconception right now, Judge Mitchell announced, his voice carrying the full weight of the judicial system. He smoothed the crisp white paper flat against his desk and prepared to read the official federal summary aloud to the silent captive court. The air in the room felt impossibly thick. Judge Mitchell cleared his throat, holding the red stapled document up to the light. According to the United States Department of Justice, the judge read his tone deliberate and echoing the individual standing before this court, whom you have repeatedly slandered as an incompetent, delusional vagrant, is nothing of the sort. He paused, letting his eyes sweep across my family before looking back down at the paper. Gwen is currently a senior partner at the most elite forensic accounting firm on Wall Street. She holds top-tier federal clearance. Furthermore, she is officially designated as the lead financial investigator appointed by the United States Federal Court for the Southern District of New York. She routinely contracts directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to dismantle high-level, multi-million-dollar white-collar crime syndicates. The words dropped like heavy stones onto the linoleum floor. In the gallery, the physical toll of that revelation hit my mother instantly. Catherine let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her knees simply gave out beneath her. She collapsed backward, her body slamming heavily into the hard wooden bench. Her designer purse slipped from her lap and spilled onto the floor, but she did not even blink. Her jaw hung slack, her eyes wide and entirely vacant. The daughter she had spent 15 years treating like a contagious disease, the daughter she had mocked as a worthless dropout to all of her country club friends, was actually operating at the absolute highest echelon of the American financial and legal system. Her entire worldview, built on my supposed failure, was vaporized in 2 sentences. At the plaintiff table, Paige reacted with violent, frantic denial. She shook her head side to side so fast her perfectly styled blonde hair whipped across her face. No, Paige stammered, her voice high and breathless. No, that is wrong. That is a mistake. She works at a coffee shop or something. She is broke. Look at her. She is just a nobody. She forged that piece of paper. She paid someone to print that. Judge Mitchell lowered the document and glared at my sister. This document bears the official seal of the United States Attorney General. The judge barked, his patience entirely exhausted. If you accuse a federal prosecutor of submitting forged documents in my courtroom one more time, I will have you remanded to a holding cell for contempt. Sit down and close your mouth, Mrs. Page. Page shrank back, hitting her chair with a heavy thud. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, looking physically ill. The golden child was finally realizing that she had brought a knife to a nuclear war. But the realization had not quite penetrated Tyrone. The absolute panic that had gripped my brother-in-law moments before suddenly mutated into a desperate, unhinged rage. His high-priced lawyer had abandoned him, his offshore gambling debts had been exposed, his mother-in-law was hyperventilating in the gallery, the walls were closing in, and Tyrone reacted the only way a malignant narcissist knows how. He doubled down on his own delusions of grandeur. Tyrone stepped aggressively away from the plaintiff table, marching into the empty space left by his fleeing attorney. He was sweating profusely now. Large, dark patches of moisture stained the underarms of his custom-tailored suit. He reached up and yanked his silk tie loose, pulling it away from his neck as if it were choking him. "I do not care," Tyrone shouted, his voice cracking with chaotic, aggressive energy. He pointed a rigid, shaking finger directly at me. "I do not care if she is an accountant. I do not care if she works for the government. She is just a glorified calculator. She is a bean counter." He turned wildly toward Judge Mitchell, slamming his hand against his own chest. "Do you know who I am?" Tyrone roared, completely losing his grip on reality. "I am the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. I own a tech conglomerate. I am a billionaire. I control tens of millions of dollars in liquid assets. I am a titan of industry. No bean counter can touch me. She cannot touch me. She is just jealous of my empire. I came in here to take pity on her, and she is using her little government connections to try and embarrass me." He was shouting at the top of his lungs, his face twisted in a mask of desperate superiority. He genuinely believed that the title he had purchased that morning made him invincible. He believed that the glossy 50-page portfolio sitting on the clerk desk was a magical shield that could deflect a federal fraud investigation. He thought his fake billions could buy him immunity from the law. He stood in the center of the courtroom, panting heavily, waiting for someone to bow down to his self-proclaimed greatness. I had stood silently behind the respondent table for the entire hearing. I had let Paige dig her own grave with perjury. I had let my mother destroy her financial future with her hateful testimony. I had let Judge Mitchell deliver the crushing blow of my true identity. Now it was my turn. I pushed my chair back. The scraping sound cut through the heavy silence that followed Tyrone's screaming outburst. I stepped out from behind the heavy wooden desk. I did not carry any folders. I did not bring my briefcase. I walked with slow, deliberate, perfectly measured steps across the polished courtroom floor. The rhythmic click of my heels echoed loudly, signaling a massive shift in the power dynamic of the room. I was no longer the respondent defending myself against a malicious family. I was the predator moving in for the kill. I stopped exactly 4 feet away from Tyrone. I was close enough to see the rapid pulse beating frantically in his neck. I was close enough to smell the sour stench of his nervous sweat completely overpowering his expensive cologne. He tried to stand tall. He tried to look down at me with his usual arrogant contempt, but his eyes were darting nervously, betraying the sheer terror hiding just beneath the surface of his bravado. I looked him dead in the eye. I did not blink. I kept my voice incredibly soft, forcing him to strain to hear the words that were about to end his life as a free man. Let us talk about your precious Vanguard holdings, Tyrone. Tyrone stood his ground, attempting to use his physical height to intimidate me. He puffed out his chest, squaring his broad shoulders, trying to project the image of a dominant, untouchable executive. But I was standing close enough to see the microscopic tremors in his hands. I could see the rapid, frantic pulse beating against the collar of his expensive custom shirt. The arrogant facade was cracking, and I was about to shatter it completely. Vanguard Holdings, I said, keeping my voice conversational yet loud enough for the court reporter to catch every single syllable. A premier developer of enterprise cloud solutions, registered in Delaware, valued on paper at $45 million. You really thought you hit the jackpot, didn't you, Tyrone? Tyrone smirked, desperate to hold on to his constructed reality. Exactly, 45 million. And I own it all. I bought it out from under a lazy board of directors. I did the due diligence. I ran the numbers. I am the sole owner of a tech empire, and you are just a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin my moment. I shook my head slowly, looking at him with genuine, undisguised pity. You own a very expensive stack of paper, Tyrone, I corrected him. There are no cloud solutions. There is no proprietary software. There are no corporate clients. Tyrone barked out a harsh laugh, turning to look at Paige for support. Paige gripped the edge of her table, her eyes darting nervously between me and her husband. You are lying! Tyrone shouted, his voice echoing toward the judge's bench. I toured the corporate headquarters in Manhattan last week. I sat in the executive boardroom. I met the chief operating officer. I saw the server farms with my own 2 eyes. I walked through the data center. You cannot stand that a black man from nothing outsmarted your entire privileged family. I took 1 step closer, invading his personal space, forcing him to look down at me. You walked through a shared workspace that was rented by the hour, I stated, coldly slicing through his delusions. The receptionist who offered you sparkling water in the lobby was a freelance actress paid $200 for the afternoon. The chief operating officer you shook hands with was a retired real estate agent hired through a casting agency. Tyrone's face twitched. He opened his mouth to argue, but I did not give him the chance to breathe. And those massive server farms you were so proud of touring? I continued, my voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. They were empty metal racks filled with cheap flashing LED lights plugged into a standard wall outlet just to make a nice humming sound. You bought a ghost, Tyrone. You bought a completely hollow synthetic entity designed specifically to look wealthy to an amateur who was too greedy to run a proper forensic background check. Tyrone was visibly shaking now. He could not accept this, his entire identity, his marriage, his leverage over my mother. Everything was built on the foundation of this corporate buyout. He reached frantically into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out his custom titanium smartphone. I will prove it, Tyrone bellowed, waving the phone in the air. I will show the court right now. I will show the judge. You are making up lies to save yourself from a psychiatric hold. He aggressively tapped his phone screen, his thumb sliding frantically across the glass. He brought up the Vanguard Holdings website. He turned the screen around, shoving it toward my face, then angled it so Judge Mitchell and Paige could clearly see the display. Look at it, Tyrone demanded, his breathing heavy and ragged. Look at the site. Look at the livestock index. Look at the client portal. It is a masterpiece. It is fully operational. It is generating revenue this exact second. You cannot fake a digital infrastructure like this. I looked at the glowing screen in his trembling hand. It showed an incredibly sleek, sophisticated corporate homepage. Deep blues and silvers dominated the layout. A scrolling banner highlighted technological achievements and global partnerships. There were high-definition photos of a towering glass office building and smiling executives. It is a beautiful website, I admitted calmly, keeping my eyes locked on the screen. I always liked that particular shade of blue. It conveys a lot of corporate trust. Now do me a favor, Tyrone. Refresh the page. Tyrone glared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and creeping panic. What? Refresh the page. I repeated, my tone dropping to a deadly, commanding whisper. Pull the live data from the server right now. Let Judge Mitchell see exactly how operational your multi-million-dollar empire really is today. Tyrone hesitated. His thumb hovered inches above the glass screen. He looked over at Paige. My sister was staring at the phone with wide, terrified eyes, her breath catching in her throat. He looked up at the gallery. My mother was clutching the wooden railing, her face pale as a sheet, waiting for her golden son-in-law to prove me wrong. Tyrone swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously. He pressed his thumb against the glass and aggressively swiped down to reload the browser. For a fraction of a second, the screen went completely white. When the page reloaded, the sleek blue and silver corporate design did not return. The scrolling stock ticker vanished. The high-definition photos of the glass building disappeared. The secure client portal was entirely gone. Instead, the screen flooded with a harsh, glaring, solid red background. A massive, intimidating federal seal appeared directly in the center of the display. Beneath the seal, bold, capitalized block letters filled the entire screen, leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation. Tyrone stared at his phone. His eyes darted frantically across the text. His mouth dropped open, but his vocal cords completely failed him. All the arrogant bravado, the loud boasting, the aggressive confidence drained out of his body in a single devastating instant. He looked like a man who had just stepped blindly off a cliff and finally realized there was no safety net waiting to catch him. Read it aloud, Tyrone, I commanded softly. He could not speak. His hands were trembling so violently that the heavy titanium phone shook uncontrollably in his grip. I turned my head slightly, projecting my voice so the judge, the bailiff, and every single person sitting in the gallery could hear the stark reality of Tyrone's situation. The banner reads, "Seized by the Internal Revenue Service and the United States Department of Justice." I stated my words, falling like heavy hammer strikes against the quiet room. The domain, the routing numbers, and all associated corporate assets have been permanently frozen under federal warrant. Tyrone's fingers went entirely slack. He lost his grip on the device. The heavy smartphone slipped from his hands, falling through the air and hitting the hard linoleum floor with a loud, sharp crack. The impact shattered the glass screen, sending a massive spiderweb of jagged lines directly across the glaring red federal warning. Tyrone stared down at the broken device resting by his expensive leather shoes. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He slowly lifted his head to look at me. The expression in his eyes was one of absolute pure horror. He finally understood that he had not just made a bad investment. He had walked willingly into a trap. How Tyrone whispered, his voice completely broken and hollow. "How do you know this? How did you do this to my company?" I took one half step closer to him. I tilted my head slightly, allowing a razor-sharp, merciless smile to spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey after years of patiently waiting in the shadows. "I know exactly what Vanguard Holdings is, Tyrone," I said softly. "Because I am the one who created it." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Tyrone stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his shattered phone completely forgotten on the floor by his expensive leather shoes. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, raspy sound emerged. His brain was violently rejecting the information. He had spent years building his entire identity around being the smartest, wealthiest man in any room. He could not comprehend that the woman he had relentlessly mocked as a pathetic dropout was the actual architect of his destruction. "You created it," Tyrone finally whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and absolute terror. "That is impossible. You do not have the capital. You do not have the resources to build a $45 million tech conglomerate. I did not build a tech conglomerate, Tyrone, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and ensuring every syllable reached the judge's bench. I built a trap. Vanguard Holdings is a dummy corporation. It is a synthetic shell company engineered specifically by my forensic accounting firm in direct conjunction with federal authorities. We designed it from the ground up to act as a digital honey trap. Its entire purpose is to attract, monitor, and track high-level money launderers and offshore gambling syndicates. We made it look like a highly valuable, vulnerable startup with a disorganized board of directors. We made it look like easy prey for arrogant criminals looking to clean their dirty money. I took another step toward him, locking my eyes onto his terrified face. The sheer magnitude of his mistake was finally beginning to dawn on him. You thought you were a corporate genius, I continued, my voice echoing in the silent courtroom. You thought you discovered a secret loophole to acquire a massive asset for a fraction of its cost. You did not outsmart anyone. You took the bait. We monitored every single email you sent to our fake board members. We tracked every fraudulent financial statement you submitted during the acquisition process. We traced the $2.5 million you wired to the Cayman Islands directly back to your illicit gambling debts. You willingly walked into a federally monitored cage and you locked the door behind yourself. The full weight of my words slammed into the plaintiff table. The high-priced corporate lawyer who had been standing frozen in shock suddenly sprang into frantic motion. He realized instantly that the situation had escalated from a simple family court dispute into a massive federal felony trap. He had just stood before a judge and presented documents proving his own client had successfully acquired a government surveillance shell company using illicit offshore funds. The lawyer did not say another word in defense of his client. He violently grabbed his loose papers and shoved them into his expensive leather briefcase. He slammed the lid down, the sharp metallic snap of the golden latches echoing loudly through the room like a gunshot. He grabbed his briefcase by the handle and turned to march directly down the center aisle of the courtroom. Tyrone spun around, panic taking over his entire body. He lunged forward and grabbed the sleeve of the lawyer's suit jacket, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric. "Wait," Tyrone pleaded, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Where are you going? You cannot leave me here. You have to fix this. Tell the judge there was a mistake in the paperwork. File a motion to reverse the acquisition. Do your job and get me out of this." The corporate lawyer stopped in his tracks. He slowly turned his head to look at the man gripping his sleeve. The lawyer's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic mixed with furious self-preservation. He was looking at a man who was essentially radioactive. "Let go of me," the lawyer demanded, his voice low and vibrating with intense fear. He aggressively yanked his arm free from Tyrone's grasp. "I am not filing anything. You lied to me about the source of your funding. You lied to me about the nature of this company. You brought me into a federal courtroom to finalize the acquisition of a government honeypot. I am not losing my law license for you. I am not going to federal prison for a con artist. You are completely on your own." The lawyer did not look back. He practically sprinted toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom, pushing his way out and disappearing into the hallway. The heavy doors swung shut with a resounding thud, sealing Tyrone inside. Tyrone stood completely alone in the center of the legal floor. His legal counsel had abandoned him. His mother-in-law was still slumped in the gallery, paralyzed by the destruction of her financial security and the realization that her house was tied to a fraud. His wife, Paige, was pressing herself against the far wall of the courtroom, trying to physically distance herself from the catastrophic fallout of his actions. She looked at him not with love, but with profound horror and disgust. Tyrone turned slowly back to face me. The arrogant tech mogul facade was entirely gone. He was nothing more than a terrified, exposed fraud realizing the true extent of his peril. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the total collapse of his reality. "Please," Tyrone stammered, holding his hands up in a pathetic, placating gesture. "We can undo this. I will sign the company back over to you. I will give it all back. Just call off the federal agents. Tell the judge it was a familial misunderstanding. We are Family Gwen. We can resolve this privately without the authorities." I shook my head slowly, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the man who had spent years degrading me and plotting to steal my livelihood. "You do not get to invoke family now, Tyrone," I stated coldly. "You walked into this courtroom today intending to strip me of my human rights. You intended to lock me in a psychiatric ward so you could drain my bank accounts and fund your lavish lifestyle. You stood there and mocked me while my mother and sister cheered you on. You forged signatures, you committed perjury, and you lied to acquire my shell company just so you could flex your imaginary wealth on my family. I reached into my briefcase one final time. I pulled out a single sheet of red-stamped federal documentation, holding it up so the harsh courtroom lighting illuminated the official seals. But in your desperate rush to look like a billionaire, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly razor-sharp whisper, you failed to read the fine print of your own acquisition contract. I looked him dead in the eye, delivering the final crushing blow. When you forged signatures and lied to acquire my shell company just to flex on my family, do you know what else you legally acquired? When you forged signatures and lied to acquire my shell company just to flex on my family, do you know what else you legally acquired? I did not wait for his answer. I let the question hang in the cold courtroom air for a brief, agonizing second. Then I slammed the red-stamped federal document down onto the edge of the plaintiff table right in front of his shaking hands. You acquired the attached liabilities, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute crushing clarity. A federal honey trap designed to catch high-level offshore gambling syndicates has to look completely authentic. It has to look like a distressed corporate asset desperate for a cash injection. Money launderers look for companies drowning in red ink to hide their illicit funds. So my forensic accounting team legally burdened Vanguard Holdings with a massive corporate tax deficit. It is a financial black hole designed to swallow criminals exactly like you. I tapped my index finger hard against the official government seal on the paper. By aggressively rushing the paperwork to impress my mother, by forging signatures to bypass the standard waiting periods, and by officially signing your name as the sole owner and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, you did not just buy a fake company. I looked at the beads of sweat dripping off his chin. You legally assumed 100% of its attached federal liabilities. You signed a binding government contract, taking full personal responsibility for a $30 million tax debt to the Internal Revenue Service. Tyrone staggered backward as if he had been physically struck in the chest. His knees buckled slightly, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum floor. He reached out and grabbed the back of a wooden chair just to keep himself from collapsing completely. 30 million! Tyrone gasped, his voice barely a hollow rasp. The number seemed to break his brain. He shook his head violently, his eyes wide and unfocused. No, that is a mistake. I only put down 2.5 million. I am not paying $30 million. The government cannot make me pay that. I did not know. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense when you commit wire fraud to buy a corporation, I replied coldly. The federal agents waiting outside this courtroom do not care about your excuses. The IRS does not care that you wanted to look like a billionaire to your in-laws. You signed the federal acquisition papers, Tyrone. You are legally the sole proprietor of a $30 million deficit. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your assets are seized. You are completely and utterly ruined. Tyrone turned his desperate, terrified eyes toward Judge Mitchell. He looked like a drowning man begging for a life raft. Your Honor, Tyrone pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. You have to stop this. You are a judge. Issue an order to cancel the contract. She tricked me. This is entrapment. You have to void the sale. Judge Mitchell looked down from his high mahogany bench. His expression was entirely devoid of mercy. He viewed Tyrone not as a victim but as a predator who had carelessly stepped into his own snare. Mr. Tyrone, Judge Mitchell stated, his tone freezing the air in the room. You stand in my courtroom exposed as a fraud who attempted to manipulate the legal system to steal from a vulnerable family member. You admitted to funding this acquisition with illegal offshore money. I have absolutely no jurisdiction over a federal tax seizure, and even if I did, I would not lift a single finger to help you. You forged your own path to ruin. Now you will walk it. The reality of the situation crashed down upon the plaintiff table. Sitting just 2 feet away from Tyrone, Page had been listening in absolute paralyzed horror. The golden child of our family, the woman who had spent her entire life basking in unearned luxury and mocking my existence, suddenly realized her perfect world was evaporating. There would be no yacht. There would be no $10 million payday. The wealthy, powerful husband she had flaunted to our mother was nothing but a broke, fraudulent criminal drowning in $30 million of federal debt. Paige reacted with pure, unadulterated selfishness. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream and physically leaped away from the table. She shoved her chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. She scrambled backward, pressing her back flat against the wooden partition, separating the legal floor from the gallery. She looked at Tyrone as if he were covered in a deadly, highly contagious virus. "Get away from me!" Paige shrieked, holding her hands up to shield herself from her own husband. "Do not look at me. I have nothing to do with this. I did not know he was a fake. I did not know about the offshore accounts. I am a victim here." Tyrone looked at his wife in shock. The man who had been her partner in crime just 20 minutes ago, laughing about stealing my money on a recorded hot mic, was now watching her abandon ship the second the hull breached. Paige, Tyrone begged, reaching a trembling hand out toward her. "Baby, please, we can fix this. We are a team. Do not call me baby." Paige roared, her face contorted with panic and fury. "We are not a team. You are a liar. You dragged me into a federal courtroom and embarrassed me. I did not sign those acquisition papers. I did not buy that stupid fake company. I am filing for divorce right now, today. I want an annulment. I want nothing to do with you or your massive debts." She turned her frantic eyes toward Judge Mitchell, pointing an accusing finger at her husband. "Your Honor, I want a divorce on the record," Paige demanded, her voice shrill and echoing. "I am completely innocent. I separate myself from his liabilities entirely. He acted alone. He owes the government $30 million, not me. I am legally washing my hands of him right now." My mother, Catherine, watched this brutal betrayal from her seat in the gallery. Her perfect family was tearing itself to shreds. The son-in-law she had worshipped was a massive fraud. The daughter she had elevated above me was screaming for a divorce in a public courthouse to save her own skin. I watched Paige press herself against the wall, breathing heavily, entirely convinced that throwing Tyrone under the bus would magically erase her from the narrative. She truly believed that saying the word divorce out loud would create a protective shield around her precious, entitled life. I turned my body slowly. I faced my sister, maintaining my perfect, unshakable calm. The continuous flow of conflict had not yet reached its peak. She thought the trap was only meant for Tyrone. She had no idea how deeply she had buried herself. I reached into my slim black briefcase one final time. I pulled out a single neatly folded document. It was the mortgage agreement my mother had signed over to Tyrone. "You think you can just walk away from this, Paige?" I asked softly. Paige glared at me, her chest heaving. "Yes, I did not sign the corporate acquisition contract. I am legally insulated. You cannot touch me, Gwen. You caught him, not me." I unfolded the document and smoothed it out on the table. "Actually, Paige," I said, raising my voice so it carried clearly to the gallery where my mother sat in stunned silence. "Corporate structuring requires a certain level of verified identity to secure massive capital. To secure the remainder of the leverage using Mom's house as collateral, the bank required a secondary corporate officer with a matching family name to satisfy their temporary risk assessment. Tyrone needed someone with a clean background to act as a guarantor on the paperwork before he wired the funds to the Cayman Islands." I slid the paper across the long wooden table. It came to a stop right at the edge, directly in front of where Paige was standing against the wall. "So to secure the mortgage on Mom's house," I concluded, my words falling like an executioner's blade, "Tyrone listed you as the co-chief financial officer of Vanguard Holdings. You signed the guarantor agreement right next to his name." Paige looked down at the paper. She saw her own signature in blue ink, signed cheerfully just days ago when she thought she was securing her wealthy future. Her eyes went completely blank. "You are on the hook for the $30 million too, Paige." The silence that followed my statement was absolute. Paige stared down at the piece of paper resting on the edge of the plaintiff table. She stared at her own looping signature in bright blue ink. The reality of the $30 million federal tax debt was no longer an abstract concept belonging to her husband. It was directly tethered to her own name. "No," Paige gasped, her voice barely a breath. She backed away from the table, shaking her head so violently her hair whipped across her shoulders. I did not know what this was. He told me it was just a formality. He told me I was signing a standard bank form to help secure the loan for Mom's house. I did not agree to be a corporate officer for a shell company. I was tricked. Tyrone, who had been standing frozen in his own private nightmare, suddenly snapped to life. The instinct for self-preservation overrode whatever affection he held for his wife. He turned on her with vicious speed. "Do not play the innocent victim now," Tyrone shouted, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. "You knew exactly what we were doing. You were the one pushing me to close the deal faster. You were the one who wanted the yacht. You were the one complaining that your sister had $10 million while we were living off my credit cards. You signed that paper because you wanted to be the vice president of a tech empire. You wanted the title. You wanted the status. You do not get to abandon me now that the bill is due." "I am not paying $30 million for your fake company," Paige screamed, her face contorting with absolute rage. "You lied to me. You told me you were a millionaire. You told me you had offshore accounts full of legitimate cash. You are nothing but a broke, fraudulent con artist. You used my mother to buy a trap. You ruined my life." "I ruined your life!" Tyrone roared back, stepping aggressively toward her. "You drained every account I ever had trying to keep up with your rich friends. You demanded the designer clothes and the luxury cars. You forced me to take desperate measures to maintain the illusion you required to feel superior to your own sister. We are in this together, Paige. The federal government does not care if you read the fine print. You signed the document. You are going down with me." The beautiful, perfectly curated facade of the golden couple was completely obliterated. They stood in the center of the federal courtroom, screaming at each other, tearing their marriage to shreds in front of the judge, the bailiff, and the gallery. They were two parasites suddenly realizing they had attached themselves to a sinking ship, and they were perfectly willing to drown each other to stay afloat. From the gallery, a low, guttural moan interrupted their screaming match. Catherine had been sitting slumped on the hard wooden bench since hearing about my true profession. Now a new horror was slowly working its way through her mind. I watched my mother process the brutal mathematics of the situation. Tyrone and Paige owed the Internal Revenue Service $30 million. They had no legitimate assets. They had no real tech company. The only tangible asset securing the entire fraudulent acquisition was the collateral Tyrone had used to secure the initial loan. The collateral was Catherine's house. My house. Catherine whispered, her voice trembling with absolute terror. She slowly stood up from the bench, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the wooden railing to stay upright. My retirement home. The deed. She looked at Tyrone, the man she had worshipped and defended just an hour ago. She looked at Paige, the golden child who had happily signed away her mother's security for a chance at a yacht. "The federal government is going to take my house," Catherine said, her voice rising in pitch until it became a shrill, hysterical shriek. "The bank is going to foreclose. The IRS is going to seize my property to pay your debts. I am going to be homeless. You lost my house." Catherine shoved the swinging wooden gate open and stumbled onto the legal floor. She ignored Judge Mitchell. She ignored the armed bailiff. She marched directly toward Tyrone. "Mom, please." Tyrone started holding his hands up defensively. "We can hire a new lawyer. We can fight the seizure. I will figure it out." Catherine did not let him finish. She reached him and swung her arm with all the strength she possessed. The sharp, violent sound of her open hand slapping Tyrone across the face echoed like a firecracker. Tyrone stumbled backward, clutching his cheek in shock. Paige gasped, pressing herself further against the wall. "You worthless, lying fraud!" Catherine screamed at him, tears of pure panic streaming down her face. "You promised me wealth. You promised me you were a genius. You manipulated me into signing away the only thing I owned. You made me look like a fool in front of everyone. I gave you my sanctuary and you threw it into a federal tax trap." She then turned her furious, tear-stained face toward Paige. "And you?" Catherine shrieked at her favorite daughter. "You signed the guarantor papers. You let him risk my home. You were so greedy you did not even bother to read what you were signing. You have destroyed me. You have left me with absolutely nothing." The complete destruction of their toxic alliance was breathtaking to witness. The mother who had enabled their cruelty, the sister who had initiated the attack, and the brother-in-law who had executed the fraud were now openly destroying each other. They had spent years united by their shared disdain for me, but the moment real consequences appeared, they turned into a pack of starving wolves, turning on their own. Catherine looked wildly around the courtroom. She looked at the judge who viewed her with cold disdain. She looked at the heavy wooden doors where Tyrone's lawyer had fled. She looked at the impending reality of losing her home, her status, and her entire identity. She had nowhere left to turn. She had alienated every single person who could have possibly helped her, every person except one. Catherine slowly turned her head and looked at me. She looked at the daughter she had spent 34 years treating like an unwanted burden. She looked at the senior partner of a Wall Street firm holding a $10 million bank account. The vindictive rage vanished from Catherine's face, replaced entirely by pathetic, desperate terror. Her knees buckled. She dropped to the hard linoleum floor right in front of the plaintiff table. She did not stand back up. Instead, weeping uncontrollably, she began to physically crawl across the courtroom floor. She dragged herself across the space separating our tables, her expensive dress sweeping against the dirt. She reached the edge of my desk. She reached up with trembling, tear-slicked hands and grabbed my fingers, clutching them like a drowning woman grabbing a lifeline. "Gwen." Catherine sobbed, her face stained with ruined makeup as she looked up at me from her knees. "Gwen, please, you have to save me." My mother remained on her knees, her hands resting limply on the floor where I had just pulled my fingers from her grasp. The brutal reality of her situation had completely paralyzed her. She stared blankly at the hem of my tailored suit, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The devastating truth was that she had handed the keys to her entire life over to a fraud, and she had done it solely to fund my destruction. Now she had to live in the wreckage of her own choices. Judge Mitchell had seen absolutely enough. He leaned back in his high leather chair, his face a mask of cold, uncompromising judicial authority. He looked down at the chaotic mess of my family scattered across his courtroom. He looked at Paige, who was still pressing herself against the wooden partition, desperately trying to distance herself from the catastrophic $30 million federal tax debt she had willingly signed her name to. He looked at Tyrone, who was pacing near the plaintiff table like a trapped rat looking for a crack in the baseboards. Finally, he looked back to his desk. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He did not strike the sounding block with the explosive violence he had used earlier. He brought it down with a firm, definitive, heavy thud that signaled the absolute end of their malicious legal campaign. "This court has entertained this circus for long enough," Judge Mitchell announced, his voice projecting a commanding, resonant finality that demanded absolute silence. "I have presided over family court for nearly 3 decades, and I have rarely witnessed such a coordinated, malicious, and entirely fraudulent abuse of the judicial process." He pointed a stern finger directly at my sister. "Mrs. Page, your petition for a permanent conservatorship over your sister is hereby denied. Furthermore, it is denied with prejudice. You are legally barred from ever filing a similar petition in this jurisdiction again. You came into my courtroom, swore an oath to tell the truth, and then attempted to weaponize the legal system to commit grand larceny against a federal investigator. You submitted fraudulent medical documents, and you committed perjury with zero hesitation." Paige squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears of absolute terror leaking down her flushed cheeks. She had expected to walk out of this building as a millionaire. Now she was walking out as a ruined woman. Judge Mitchell then turned his attention to the court clerk sitting just below his bench. "Collect every single exhibit submitted by the petitioner today." Judge Mitchell ordered, his tone clipping through the heavy air. "I want the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. I want the glossy financial portfolio outlining the acquisition of Vanguard Holdings. I want a certified transcript of the hot mic audio recording presented by the respondent. Seal all of it in an evidence box immediately." The clerk nodded sharply and began gathering the stack of lies Tyrone and Paige had so proudly dropped onto the desk just an hour ago. "You will hand-deliver that evidence box directly to the district attorney's office by the end of the day." Judge Mitchell continued, locking his gaze onto Tyrone. "I am officially referring this entire matter for criminal prosecution. Submitting forged financial documents to a judge is a felony. Attempting to acquire a federal honey trap Using illicit offshore funds is a federal crime. You will not be walking away from this courtroom today with just a dismissed petition. You are going to answer for every single lie you brought into my jurisdiction." The word criminal echoed in Tyrone's ears. The reality of the district attorney receiving his fake corporate buyout papers finally broke his paralysis. Tyrone's fight or flight instinct violently kicked in, and he chose flight. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at his mother-in-law weeping on the floor. He abandoned them instantly. Tyrone spun around, his expensive leather shoes screeching harshly against the polished linoleum floor. He shoved past the swinging wooden gate with such aggressive force that the hinges groaned loudly. He locked his eyes on the heavy brass-handled double doors at the back of the courtroom. That was his only exit. He thought if he could just make it out of the building, he could disappear. He thought he could run from a $30 million federal tax debt and a criminal fraud referral. Tyrone sprinted down the center aisle of the gallery. "Stop right there!" the armed court bailiff shouted, stepping quickly away from his post by the wall and reaching for his utility belt. But Tyrone was moving fast, propelled by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a con artist who knew his game was over. He was only 10 feet away from the doors. He reached his hand out, his fingers desperately stretching toward the heavy brass handle that stood between him and freedom. He never even touched the brass. Suddenly, the back row of the spectator gallery erupted into motion. 4 men who had been sitting quietly on the wooden benches for the entire duration of the hearing stood up in perfect simultaneous unison. They were dressed in inconspicuous dark gray suits. They had watched my mother's screaming tantrums. They had listened to Paige's fake panic attack. They had observed Tyrone's arrogant boasting. They had simply blended into the background, waiting for their exact moment to strike. They were federal agents, and they belonged to my investigative task force. As Tyrone lunged for the door handle, the lead agent stepped seamlessly into the center aisle, completely blocking the exit. He moved with a swift, calculated tactical precision that Tyrone could not possibly evade. Tyrone slammed directly into the federal agent's chest. The impact halted his momentum entirely. Before Tyrone could even attempt to throw a punch or pivot toward the other side of the room, the 3 remaining agents collapsed upon him. They grabbed Tyrone by his custom-tailored shoulders and forcefully spun him around. They shoved him face first against the heavy wooden doors. The thud of his body hitting the solid oak echoed sharply across the silent courtroom. Tyrone let out a muffled grunt as the lead agent pinned his arms behind his back. He struggled for a brief, pathetic second, kicking his expensive shoes against the floor, but the federal agents held him with an unbreakable iron grip. The cold metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Tyrone's wrists rang out with absolute clarity. It was the sharpest, most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The arrogant tech mogul who had spent years degrading me was now pressed flat against a door bound in federal chains. Down by the plaintiff table, Paige watched her husband get tackled and handcuffed by the FBI. The reality of her own signature on those fraudulent banking documents crashed down upon her. She realized the agents were not just there for Tyrone. Paige let out a high-pitched, guttural wail of pure despair as a 5th agent, a tall woman in a dark suit, stepped through the gallery gate and walked directly toward her. The agent stopped right in front of my sister. She pulled a set of handcuffs from her belt. "Paige, you have the right to remain silent," the agent stated coldly, her voice cutting through my sister's hysterical sobbing as she read her Miranda rights as a federal Keogh conspirator. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind us, muting the chaotic aftermath of Judge Mitchell's ruling. I stepped out into the expansive, brightly lit marble hallway of the federal building. The air out here was entirely different. It was crisp, professional, and completely indifferent to the shattered lives my family had just created for themselves. My attorney walked beside me. His briefcase secured his expression, one of quiet satisfaction. We had executed the operation flawlessly. Behind us, the commotion spilled out into the corridor. The federal agents were moving efficiently, guiding their new prisoners out into the open space. I stopped near a massive stone pillar, turning just enough to watch the final destruction of the golden couple. Tyrone emerged first. The swaggering tech entrepreneur was completely gone. His expensive custom suit hung awkwardly on his frame, wrinkled and soaked with nervous sweat. His hands were securely fastened behind his back with heavy steel cuffs. The cold metal glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor. He walked with his head down his chin, practically resting on his chest, unable to meet the eyes of the courthouse staff and passing attorneys. He looked exactly like what he was, a broken, exposed fraud who had finally hit a brick wall he could not talk his way around. The federal agents flanked him on both sides, their faces completely devoid of emotion, executing their duties with mechanical precision. Paige followed a few seconds later, escorted by the tall female agent. My sister was not going quietly. The pristine white designer suit she had worn to impress the judge was now a rumpled, pathetic mess. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her voice hoarse from screaming. She was actively fighting the agent's grip, digging the heels of her expensive shoes into the polished marble floor, desperately trying to halt her own perp walk. "I am innocent!" Paige shrieked, her voice echoing wildly down the long, cavernous corridor. "I did not buy that company. I am a victim of financial abuse. You have to let me go. I demand a phone call. I am divorcing him. Do you know who my family is?" The federal agent did not even blink. She maintained a firm, unyielding grip on Paige's arm, marching her steadily toward the bank of stainless steel elevators at the far end of the hall. The reality of her situation was completely incompatible with her country club entitlement. Tyrone and Paige were shoved into the same elevator car. As the metal doors began to slide shut, Paige launched one final venomous glare at her husband, screaming that he had ruined her perfect life. The doors clamped together with a heavy metallic thud, cutting off her hysterics entirely. They were gone. They were heading to federal processing, where their fake wealth and societal status meant absolutely nothing. With the chaotic noise of my sister's arrest finally silenced, the hallway felt incredibly hollow. I turned my attention to the only family member left. My mother, Catherine, was sitting alone on a hard wooden public bench just outside the courtroom doors. She looked incredibly small. The aggressive, domineering matriarch who had spent the last 34 years belittling my existence had completely evaporated. She sat hunched over her shoulders, shaking with silent sobs. In her trembling hands, she clutched the bank foreclosure notice Tyrone's lawyer had callously left behind on the plaintiff table. The crisp official paper was quickly becoming crumpled and stained with her tears. That single document represented the total annihilation of her identity. She had willingly signed away her sanctuary, her retirement, and her status, all to fund the illusion of a wealthy son-in-law who could help her crush me. Now the bank was coming for her property, and the Internal Revenue Service was lining up right behind them to devour whatever was left. I began walking toward the exit. My path required me to pass directly in front of